Good morning, guys. This is for AP Environmental Science. This is your Unit 7, which deals with air pollution. So we're going to start off by making this table. Again, for this special year, the test is going to be open notes, so you won't have to memorize this stuff. Luckily, you can just refer to it in your notes if you need it. So the big thing is to recognize that air pollution affects all of us. It's especially prevalent now with the COVID-19 thing affecting our lungs. Having healthy lungs and breathing clean air is something that we actually probably take for granted because that's the way that this virus is killing people. It's by clogging up their lungs so they can't get enough oxygen and they literally suffocate to death. So having clean air to breathe so that our body can get the oxygen we need is super, super important. So some of this stuff we've talked about throughout the year. We have talked about the 6 criteria pollutants that were first addressed by the Clean Air Act. Remember, the Clean Air Act is a major legislation in the United States that first addressed cleaning up the air, especially in some of our cities that had dirty air, like Los Angeles in particular, but other cities around the world as well. So the 6 air pollutants first addressed by the Clean Air Act, one of them was SOx. And the most important one of those is sulfur dioxide, or SO2, which is the one that I want you to put on your AP exam. You need to know the major sources of this is coal burning. And again, coal burning is mainly used to generate electricity. It used to be the #1 fuel in the United States, but it's now a distant #2 to natural gas, and it's been declining. And then the other one that we still use is diesel fuel. So especially big trucks, or in fact some cars run on diesel fuel. Diesel fuel has sulfur in it. The federal regulations, I think, require it to be less than 15 parts per million, but it gets expensive to take more sulfur out, but diesel fuel is another one. So diesel fuel used in trucking would be your other one. The effects of SOx for human health is just like everything pretty much. It's a respiratory irritant. And remember, respiratory irritant or respiratory problems, you can say stuff like coughing, wheezing, shortness of breath, bronchitis, which is inflammation of your lungs, and stuff like that. So respiratory irritant is probably the #1 thing to go with, and then be a little bit more specific and list some of that stuff, which I'm not going to write down. Biggest environmental effect is it creates acid rain, and we're actually going to put the chemical equations on another sheet. So for another different video, we'll be writing those down so you have those in your notes as well. So acid rain does a couple things. One is it can acidify the soil, which can affect or reduce plant growth. And that's the main effect of environmental. Of course, if an animal breathes air, then it can be a respiratory irritant for animals that breathe in air as well. All right, second one is NOx emissions. NOx emissions mainly come from combustion. If I can get that thing to stop popping up. So when we burn gasoline in our cars or diesel fuel in our cars or burn anything in our atmosphere, because 78% of our atmosphere is nitrogen gas and the 20% oxygen, those things combine in the combustion chamber and produce NOx emissions. So just like SOx, it is a respiratory irritant. And NOx is the other thing that produces acid rain, which again does the same thing, acidifies soil. The other thing you can say for NOx is it damages plant tissue. As well. So NOx and SOx are the two things. Remember, SOx combined with water makes sulfuric acid, and NOx combined with water makes nitric acid, but we'll put those in your notes at a later place. Okay. Next one is carbon monoxide, or CO. Carbon monoxide, again, comes from incomplete combustion. So when you combust or burn something like gasoline or a log that's made of carbon in our atmosphere that's 20% oxygen or 21% oxygen, those two things can combine to make CO. Ideal combustion would make CO2, but if there's not enough oxygen around to complete the combustion of conversion of CO to CO2, then we end up with some amount of carbon monoxide. Okay. So health effects is it can cause carbon monoxide poisoning, which can ultimately lead to death, and it does kill hundreds of people throughout the United States every single year. Usually it's because of a malfunctioning heater or a pipe that's supposed to vent those fumes to the outside get clogged up. So mainly this is an indoor air pollutant. And the same thing for environmental effects. It can reduce plant growth because plants want to take in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, and carbon monoxide would affect that particular process. All right, next one is PM, which stands for particulate matter. You can think of particulate matter as dust or sand or smoke blowing through the air. It comes from automobiles. So any transportation, as cars go along the road, they kick up dust, even on a concrete or asphalt surface, but if they go through a dusty road, then that's going to produce even more particulate matter. There's two subcategories of that. There's what they call PM10. The 10 refers to the size of the particle. That means it's 10 microns. And then PM 2.5 would be 2.5 microns as a size. The dangerous thing about the PM 2.5 is it can get really deep in your lungs because it's a small particle. So our natural body defenses against getting particulate matter in our lungs, like the mucus that we produce or the cough that we do or cough that we get when we breathe in particulate matters, that's all to try and get it out of our lungs and keep it from getting in our lungs in the first place. Once it gets in our lungs, it can cause irritation in there, lead to bronchitis or inflammation, and potentially even to lung cancer as well. So our bodies do a good job of keeping it out of our lungs, but the smaller the particles, the easier it is for it to actually get into our lungs. Okay. So health effects, like everything, or most of these things, it's a respiratory irritant that can lead to coughing, bronchitis, shortness of breath, stuff like that. Okay. As far as environmental effects go, it blocks sunlight. And if you block sunlight, that can reduce photosynthesis. You can think of these two things. Particulate matter in the air is just like turbidity is to water. So basically the particles floating around in the air. All right, next one is ozone. And in this case, we're talking about tropospheric ozone, or stuff that's located in the troposphere, which again is the lowest layer of the atmosphere. It's the one where we live and work and breathe. So the troposphere, ozone is bad in the troposphere. In the stratosphere, ozone is good because it makes up the ozone layer and that protects us from the UV rays of the sun. The ozone in the stratosphere is not something they're tested on this year's test. We have mentioned it in class before, but we're not going to go into it in more detail. So you want to worry about the ozone in the troposphere. And ozone is O3, which is not a very stable molecule. Oxygen likes to be O2. So it wants to give up this other oxygen readily, and that's what leads to problems. So ozone is what we call a secondary pollutant. So it forms in the atmosphere, and we'll talk more about that later on as well. So mainly this comes from transportation too. So cars, trucks, trains, stuff like that. Health effects is it's definitely a respiratory irritant. It's the one that when you breathe in really, really deep on a day where the air pollution's not very good, it can really cause your lungs to burn, as well as NOx as well. And it can lead to reduced plant growth. All right, last one is lead. Again, this is not a big problem anymore, and we've talked about lead all year long. It used to be in gasoline, but it's not anymore because they took all the lead out in the 1970s. Health effects, as you guys all know, is a neurotoxin. And then for plants, we're not going to really worry about too much about that. Again, lead's not a big problem anymore, but it was one of the original 6. Okay. All right, so on the next page, we're going to talk about some of the newer stuff that we haven't talked about because we've talked about these 6 all year long. So next, on the next page, we'll talk about some other air pollutants. Some of these are now addressed by the Clean Air Act, but they weren't the ones of the original 6 when they first passed that particular act back in the 70s. All right. One is VOCs, and that stands for volatile organic compounds. And there's hundreds, if not thousands, of these different types of compounds. Anything that's a solvent or anything that evaporates in the air when you're at room temperature, so like acetone, or girls, your nail polish that's sometimes made out of acetone or other organic compounds would be an example of a VOC. So major sources of this is it comes from industry. A lot of places use this as cleaners or in their process. So it comes from businesses or industry. It also comes from transportation. And again, that's because gasoline is a VOC because it'll evaporate at room temperature. Health effects of VOCs is it is a respiratory irritant. It's one of the components of smog, which we'll talk about in the next video. And it can cause damage to your liver and your kidneys because your body has to try and get rid of that stuff, which it does through the liver and the kidneys. So it can lead to damage in liver and kidneys. It can also cause cancer in animals as well as human beings. But we'll just put it over there. Okay. Another air pollutant is pesticide. That's because usually we spray these things either from a helicopter or a plane or just from the back of a truck. So this comes from farming. And again, because we're spraying it in the air, it can get into the air as an aerosol, so it could be considered an air pollutant as well. A lot of these are endocrine disruptors, which we've talked about already this year, which affects the reproductive system and your hormone system. Some of them are cancer causing as well. And you can say the same thing over here. So this is true over here as well for animals. And obviously pesticides are designed to kill plants, especially if they're an herbicide, so they kill weeds and stuff like that. Another air pollutant is cigarette smoke or even secondhand cigarette smoke. Or anything that you smoke that has toxic chemicals in it. So some like cigars or even vaping products that have carcinogens in them potentially can be affected by this as well. So obviously this comes from smoking. Health effects, the specific one is emphysema, which can lead to lung cancer. And then the environmental effects would be the same on animals as well. All right, next one we're going to talk about is PANS. And that is short for peroxyl acyl nitrates. So there's your P, there's your A, there's your N. So this is stuff that comes from cars. It is what we call a secondary pollutant, which again we'll go into more detail in the next video or the next two videos on. Health effects is respiratory irritant. And same thing for animals as well. All right, the other three are ones we've already talked about. These are some of the indoor air pollutants that we talked about earlier this year. So one is asbestos. Major sources, construction materials, like floor tiles and ceiling insulation and just insulation in your attic and stuff like that. Health effects, again, is lung cancer. The specific type is mesothelioma. And that's for humans. Other indoor air pollutant we talked about earlier this year was radon. Remember, that comes from the decay of uranium that is naturally found in rocks or soil, and it leads to lung cancer. In fact, it's the second leading cause of lung cancer in the United States, other than smoking is number one. I remember this stuff is in the soil, so when you dig a basement to build your house, some houses have basements, that radon can seep through any cracks in the basement, so you would want to seal cracks in the basement to keep it out, keep it from getting into your house, or any indoor air pollutant. The main way that you decrease that is to ventilate that pollutant to the outside air. And then the other one we talked about that's an indoor air pollutant was formaldehyde, or any of the aldehydes. And this is naturally found in wood products like wood flooring and some construction products as well. This is listed as a probable carcinogen. And remember, it's naturally found in wood products because trees use formaldehyde or some aldehyde compounds as a natural defense against predators. So it's just inevitable that when you cut down the tree and you make that wood into a wood product and bring it into your house, some of those formaldehydes will basically kind of seep out of the material and into the air surrounding it, the air that's in your house. And since we live and breathe that air, it can potentially cause problems as well. In low levels, it would be pretty natural, but some products like wood flooring, for instance, that comes from China, they found has excessive amounts of formaldehydes in them. Okay. All right, that's it for this first video. Again, you don't have to memorize this stuff because you can pull up these notes. You just need to make sure that you're organized, since this is going to be an open note test this year. Again, these ones are your indoor air pollutants that we already did talk about. These are the ones that are kind of new that we'll be focusing more on in the next set of upcoming notes.